The truck filled with potatoes pulls up to the Frito-Lay plant in Illinois, Connecticut. From the point of view of the people at Frito-Lay, this truckload of potatoes is the population. They want to know whether the potatoes in the truckload will make good chips. Each truckload carries about 45,000 pounds of potatoes. That's far too many potatoes to examine individually. Even if they could examine all of the potatoes individually, too many mistakes would be made due to human error. Instead, Frito-Lay takes a sample. An inspector fills five 30-pound buckets up along the length of the truck. Frito-Lay can get better information by taking this 150-pound sample than with any attempt to inspect the entire truckload. First, the inspector randomly selects 40 pounds of potatoes and punches a core down the middle of each potato. The hole in the potato chip makes it easy to spot on the assembly line when these potatoes go through the cooking process. Then the inspector takes another random 10 pounds of potatoes and sets them aside. This makes an even 100 pounds of potatoes left on the inspection table. The inspector searches for internal defects, green edges, and mechanical damages and other qualities. Next, each defective potato is weighed. If the fraction of the sample that is defective is too large, the entire shipment of potatoes will be rejected. Meanwhile, Rita has peeled the cooking samples so that she can put them directly into the slicing machine. From there, they become chips. Rita picks out the chips from the sample and delivers them to a mini laboratory right on the plant floor. Less than 45 minutes later, Rita has both the results of the cooking sample and the inspection data. Everything meets specs. So, based on a sample, Frito-Lay will accept this shipment of potatoes. Rita informs the shipment driver that he can go ahead and load up his potatoes and get them on the assembly line. This lot of potatoes is on its way. The receiving department has approved this entire shipment of 45,000 potatoes from a representative sample of just 150 pounds.
We have seen that larger random samples tend to be more like the population from which they are drawn than smaller ones. It is natural to think that this is because a larger fraction of the population has been sampled, but this is not so. In fact, all that matters is the sample size, and that the sample is drawn randomly. The size of the population, or fraction sampled, doesn't matter at all. Here is a useful analogy. Suppose you have two pots of soup, one small and one large. You want to check the saltiness of each one. Naturally, you draw samples. You stir the soup in the smaller pot to randomize it, and select a teaspoonful at random to taste. Because you have selected your sample at random, you have confidence that it will give you a good idea of the saltiness of the soup in the small pot. To reach a similar conclusion about the larger pot, would you need to taste a larger spoonful, perhaps a ladleful of soup, just because it has more soup? Of course not. A teaspoonful of soup gives as good an idea of the seasoning of the soup, regardless of the size of the pot. However, suppose you just dipped a toothpick into the pots to get a taste. Such a small sample would not give a very good idea of the seasoning, whether the pot was large or small. We will make this mathematically exact in subsequent lessons. When planning a sample survey, remember the tasting example and try not to land in the soup.
Hi guys, we're going to go ahead and do some notes on your sample size and bias. You're watching a couple of videos, and so I wanted you to watch the Frito-Lay video with the chips, one of my favorite ones, and the soup video about the sample sizes. So let's kind of talk about, it says make some notes here about that. So let's talk about the things I want you to have gotten from those videos. So, first of all, when you watched the soup video and they were testing about the saltiness of the soup, they said that the sample size doesn't matter. Okay, so that's one thing that we want to make note about. So, the sample size does not matter as long as it is representative of the population. Okay, so, did you need a whole ladle full because it was a bigger pot of soup? No, but a toothpick is not enough, large enough sample to get a good representation of the saltiness of the soup. So, a spoonful is good, or a sip. So the sample size doesn't matter. You don't have it. Now we're going to actually later, in this class, next semester, in fact, talk about numerically what is considered a large enough sample size whenever we're taking a sample. Okay, but also, um, I guess that's also the same thing with the Lay's potato chips. So when they did that, they had 45,000 pounds of potatoes on that truckload, and they only had to sample 150 pounds because it was a representative sample for them to be able to tell that. So the sample size doesn't matter as long as it's representative of the population. All right. Now, next, we do want to kind of talk about some poor sampling methods. Okay, so first of all, before we get into the next video, let's talk about this. So, in general, we're going to discuss how sampling methods that do not have randomization. So, see, you can see right here, the standard that we have wants you to know that non random sampling methods can potentially give you bias, okay? Because they do not use chance. So there could be some sort of pattern or some certain type of subjects that you have if you do not use randomness to get those subjects, okay? So so again, what this kind of is saying is that sampling methods that do not use some type of randomness will be poor methods because they may have bias. Okay? All right. Next, now we're going to start kind of learning some names of some of the methods of sampling that are not good sampling methods. And a convenient sampling method is one of those. So, convenient sampling method is this. It is a sampling, or it is a sample that is made up of subjects, okay, who are easy or that are easy to reach, okay? And because of that, they most likely will not represent the entire population. They will not represent the entire population, okay? So that's a problem. For example, um, if I go to the Brookshire's parking lot, and I'm going to be asking the people in the Brookshire's parking lot what's their favorite coffee place to get coffee. And so that is convenient and easy. And I may think that's random. And I may even say, like, pick every 10th customer and do systematic. But yet, that is close to a Starbucks. Okay, so it could be that I'm going to get a higher proportion of people who like Starbucks because it's close to that location. Okay, so you are you're leaving out, or not, you could be leaving out a part of the population. So because of that, the type of bias that we frequently get is called undercoverage, because you do not necessarily have um, all types of the population. Okay, but I want you to watch the Literary Digest video. Very interesting. Talks about the 1936 election. So you need to remember in the U.S. history what's happening at that time. Okay, in the early 30s, we were just coming off of the Depression. Okay, so that affects, what people had, the type of people how people were living in that time frame. Okay, so watch that Literary Digest video, and then we'll talk about these other items down here.
In 1936, the magazine Literary Digest predicted that Alf Landon would beat Franklin Roosevelt in that year's election. The magazine based its prediction on 2,376,000 questionnaires, a huge sample size. The magazine drew the survey subjects from lists of automobile and telephone owners. At the same time, a young man named George Gallup used a sample of 50,000 people and predicted that Roosevelt would win with 56% of the vote. Gallup's prediction was ridiculed as naive until the election. Roosevelt won with 62% of the vote, and Gallup's career took off like a rocket. The problem with the Literary Digest sample was the list was weighted in favor of those with enough money to buy cars and phones, a much smaller portion of the population in the 30s than it is today. The poll missed the large pro-Roosevelt sentiment among lower-income voters. This sampling design systematically missed a portion of the population, so it's an example of bias.
Poor interviewing techniques can cause problems to even the best survey design. There are several ways in which interviewing can go wrong. Here's an example of how wording of the question can be asked in radically different ways to create a bias in the response. Here, the interviewer is attempting to ask the subjects, do you think America should freeze or stop the production of nuclear warheads? So the first subject here is approached, but before he is asked the question about freezing the production of nuclear warheads, he is prompted with this statement. The Soviet Union has a slight edge on the United States in the amount of nuclear warheads. And then he asks, do you think America should freeze the production of nuclear warheads? The man responds, I don't trust the Russians. Therefore, I think America should not stop producing the nuclear warheads. The next subject approached is prompted with this statement. The Soviet Union and United States have about 50,000 nuclear warheads between them, and then followed by the main question. Do you think Americans should freeze or stop production of nuclear warheads? In this case, the woman wants to support the freeze on nuclear warheads. Therefore, you can see that the question wording of the interview prompted two different responses. Here, the interviewer is approaching a married couple. Responses may also be subject to response bias if the subject thinks others are listening. The interviewer asks, if you had to do it over again, would you marry your spouse? And the woman gives a very energetic, oh, absolutely. And the man responds with a much more reserved, yeah. Were the responses accurate or a result of the lack of privacy? Next, the interviewer approaches a very 80s person with the permed big hair, acid-washed jacket, and leopard print pants. Here we will see that the subject may voice an opinion about topics that she knows nothing about. The interviewer asks, do you support or oppose the aid that America is giving to the rebels in Eastern Alpha Centauri? And the woman promptly replies, oppose. But if you've never heard of the Eastern Alpha Centauri rebels, don't worry, they don't actually exist. Ignorance about the topic can also create response bias. Finally, the appearance of the interviewer can affect the response. Here you see the interviewer asking, do you think you can trust men with a mustache? And the women respond, yes. So the moral here is clear. How a question is asked can be even more important than what it asks about. Professional poll takers must be trained to avoid errors such as these. All right, you have just watched this Literary Digest video and this poor interviewing techniques, very poor quality video, but I really like it. It gets the point across. And so let's talk about those types of bias that were experienced during and were demonstrated during those videos. Okay, so first of all, the undercoverage. Okay, so the Literary Digest had represented a serious form of undercoverage. And by definition, it says when part of the population has a reduced chance of being included in the sample will typically not be representative of the population. So, how did that happen here? You know, what specific, because here's what's interesting. They asked 2,000, they got responses from 2,376,000 people. So you would think with such a big sample that that would be a very good representation of the population. And those 2 million chose Alf Landon because they were unhappy with the president who was currently in office, the incumbent, Roosevelt. Well, what happened was in this situation, only the voters who own car and telephone. See, the Literary Digest was a magazine. So if they used, Plus, who could afford the luxury of also having that magazine subscription? So that's another thing. So only voters who own car and telephone were sent the survey. So that was convenient. So that's definitely a convenience sample because they had probably a list of those people. Okay. And so what happened was this was definitely an unrepresentative sample of all adults in the 1930s. Okay. There was a ton more people in the 1930s who did not have a phone nor had a car. Many of them didn't have jobs or homes that they could get a survey. All right. So, undercoverage. That's an example of undercoverage. Now, here's another example that you might could think about. Undercoverage. Say you wanted to ask, and you wanted to ask a question, and the population you wanted to generalize to is all Aledo residences. Maybe you wanted to ask them, how many times do you cook at home during the week? Okay. And you want to get this opinion for all of the Aledo residences. And so, but what happens if you went and you surveyed a neighborhood, maybe your neighborhood even, at 3 o'clock when you get out from school? Okay. So if you want to generalize to all of Aledo, that's a problem. So generalizing to all of Aledo is a problem because, especially if you're asking a question about cooking at home. What's happening with people that are home at 3 p.m. and their propensity or their likelihood of cooking at home, as opposed to those people who are working and not at home? So that would be undercoverage. Convenient, but probably not representative of all of Aledo. Those people who aren't home are going to be the ones who aren't cooking at home as often. All right. Now, interestingly enough, I think that the Literary Digest video also gives an example of voluntary response bias. And so let's talk about that. Sometimes in statistics, you can support more than one type of bias. Okay. And so it's sometimes, and this is hard for people, it's not necessarily just one right answer. So you give an answer, but you need to support why it is that. So on quizzes and such, I frequently, and then on assignments, I put what the bias is and why it is that bias. And it has to be kind of related to what the definition is. For example, in this case, voluntary response bias happens when their sample is comprised entirely of volunteers or people who choose to participate, people who took action to give their results and give their opinion and be in the sample. Okay? So, and this sample then typically is made up of people who have a very strong opinion. They say, ooh, I really care about that, so I want to make sure that I send in my results and I take action. Okay? People who are fine with what's going on, they're like, it's whatever. So they're not going to take action. All right. So this literary digest also is an example of voluntary response bias. Okay? And here's why. They sent out those surveys to people in the mail, and then only those people who were unhappy with the current president, okay, the current president, which at that time was Roosevelt, took action to voice their opinion. Okay? So, in a voluntary response bias, you have only those, those with strong opinions will make the effort. They will call in to a poll that's online. I see it on the news a lot. They'll ask a question and they'll ask people to text in their answer or dial in or whatever it is. Well, only those people who really care about the topic are going to make an effort to have their opinion voiced. Okay? So here's another example. How about whenever you go to a restaurant? Right? If the service is good, are you going to take the time and the effort to fill out one of those survey cards? I typically don't. Now, I have, if the service was just amazing and I just had the best waitress or wait person ever, then I would fill it out and say just how amazing that person was. And so, the restaurant survey cards typically are not filled out and turned in unless the customer feels very strongly about how good or bad the service is, how good or bad the service is. Okay? And so most of the time people fill those out when they are complaining. Okay? So poor waiter, waitress, they get mostly complaints. All right. Let's take a look at this non-response bias. Non-response, by definition here, it says individuals chosen for the sample for whom data cannot be obtained, or they refuse to respond. Okay, so you're going to call these people, and you get ton of them not even answering, okay, the phone. Or you're going to call these people, and they're going to say, "No, I don't want to take your survey." Okay. Um, that happens also, man, whenever I call somewhere, like I'll call the insurance or whatever, and it'll say, you will be asked to participate in a survey at the end of the call. And I'm like, okay, so I hang up when I'm done getting my business done because I just don't really care. Now, again, if I wasn't happy, I probably would take the time. But if a ton of people, the majority of the people, so let's write that in here. So if the subjects were selected to survey, but too many of them were unable to answer. It could also be they didn't know. Like too many of them didn't never shopped at a particular store, so they couldn't voice their opinion about a particular store. Okay? Too many of them were unable or refused to respond. Maybe if it was a controversial topic, they wouldn't want to voice their opinion. Okay? So to respond. Okay, here's an example. School board elections. Wow. School board elections can be based off of like 500 to 700 votes. So when you're talking about a town such as Aledo, where there's a whole lot of people and a whole lot of people who have students in the school district, but only 500 to 700 people vote, is that really representative of all of Aledo? No, it's non-response bias. Okay. I struggle with kind of getting the voluntary response and non-response confused a bit. So, because I'm thinking to myself, people aren't going to be going to the school board elections unless they feel really strongly about their opinion. Okay. So, here's the deal. Here's a good way to tell the difference. Did people make the effort because they felt strongly about it and that was the reason that they voted? Okay, so then that would be a voluntary response. Non-response, did the interviewer try to get a whole bunch of people and then just not very many people of them would answer? So it wasn't because of an action that there's voice, that's voluntary response. It was because of apathy and non-action. So non-response. Okay, see if that kind of clears that up. It's a little confusing. It's another reason why when I give an answer for the type of bias, I support why it is I chose that. Okay, that's another reason why. Okay, now you watched the other video that was on the interviewing techniques. Okay, and so I tried to interject so that you could kind of get what was going on. So all of what happened in this one was a response bias, and there's multiple kinds of response bias. Response bias means that the response the person gave was altered because of a certain reason. The response was altered because of a certain reason and therefore was not representative. For example, here, and so the key ones that we mention in this one, so the response is altered. Okay, we'll write that out, altered. And then we say, the typical methods, typical reasons for response bias. Let's do those 4 things. Question, wording. You gave a leading question to guide someone to a particular answer. Remember, that was the nuclear war question. Okay. Lack of privacy. That was the married couple. Okay. Because they didn't want to say they weren't interested in their spouse or wouldn't do it all over again with their spouse standing there. This also could be like, are you doing drugs? And, somebody knows the right answer they're supposed to give an adult, so they're not going to answer correctly or truthfully necessarily. Okay, and the other one, ignorance. So you voice an opinion about something you know nothing about, and then appearance. Do you think you can trust a man with a mustache? And the guy's got a mustache. Okay. All right. So the responses are typically altered because of a leading question or social desirability. Okay, so there are your notes then for these poor sampling methods and the types of bias. I hope that those make sense to you.